Section 1. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 1. Preface. The object of these few pages is not to recount once more the history of the Revolution. That can be followed in any one of 100 textbooks. Their object is rather to lay, if that be possible, an explanation of it before the English reader, so that he may understand both what it was and how it proceeded, and also why certain problems hitherto unfamiliar to Englishmen have risen out of it. First, therefore, it is necessary to set down clearly, without modern accretion, that political theory which was a sort of religious creed supplying the motive force of the whole business, of the new civil code, as of the massacres, of the panics and capitulations, as of the victories, of successful transformation of society, as of the conspicuous failures in detail which still menace the achievement of the Revolution. This grasps the way in which the main events followed each other, and the reason of their interlocking and proceeding as they did, must be put forward, not, I repeat, in the shape of a chronicle, but in the shape of a thesis. Thus the reader must know not only that the failure of the royal family's flight was followed by war, but how and why it was followed by war. He must not only appreciate the severity of the government of the Great Committee, but why that severity was present, and of the conditions of the war upon which it reposed. But in so explaining the development of the movement, it is necessary to select for appreciation as the chief figures the characters of the time, since upon their will and manner depended the fate of the whole. For instance, had the Queen been French, either in blood or in sympathy, had the King been alert, had any one character retained the old religious motives, all history would have been changed, and this human company must be seen if its action and drama are to be comprehended. The reader interested in that capital event should further seize, and but too rarely has an opportunity for seizing, its military aspect, and this difficulty of his proceeds from two causes. The first, that historians, even when they recognize the importance of the military side of some past movement, are careless of the military aspect, and think it sufficient to relate particular victories and general actions. The military aspect of any period does not consist in these, but in the campaigns of which actions, however decisive, are but incidental parts. In other words, the reader must seize the movement and design of armies if he is to seize a military period, and these are not commonly given him. In the second place, the historian, however much alive to the importance of military affairs, too rarely presents them as a part of a general position. He will make his story a story of war, or again a story of civilian development, and the reader will fail to see how the two combine. Now the Revolution, more than any other modern period, turns upon and is explained by its military history. On this account has so considerable a space been devoted to the explaining of that feature. The reader will note again that the quarrel between the Revolution and the Catholic Church has also been dealt with at length. To emphasize this aspect of the revolutionary struggle may seem unusual and perhaps deserves a word of apology. The reader is invited to consider the fact that the Revolution took place in a country which had in the first place definitely determined during the religious struggle of the 16th and 17th centuries to remain in communion with Rome, and had in the second place admitted a very large and important body of converts to the doctrines of the Reformation. The determination of the French people in the crisis of 1572 to 1610 to remain Catholic under a strong central government was a capital point in the future history of France. So was the presence of a wealthy, very large and highly cultivated body of dissentients in the midst of the nation. The two phenomena hardly coexisted elsewhere in Europe. Between them they lent to the political history of France a peculiar character which the 19th century, even more than the Revolution itself, has emphasized. And it is the opinion of the present writer that it is impossible to understand the Revolution unless very high relief is given to the religious problem. If a personal point may be noted, the fact that the writer of these pages is himself a Catholic and in political sympathy strongly attached to the political theory of the Revolution should not be hidden from the reader. Such personal conditions have perhaps enabled him to treat the matter more thoroughly than it might have been treated by one who rejected either republicanism upon the one hand or Catholicism upon the other. But he believes that no personal and therefore exaggerated note has been allowed to intrude upon his description of what is a definite piece of objective history lying in the field of record rather than in that of opinion. Some years ago the paramount importance of the quarrel between the Church and the Revolution might still have been questioned by men who had no personal experience of the struggle and of its vast results. Today the increasing consequences and the contemporary violence of that quarrel make its presentation an essential part of any study of the period. The scheme thus outlined will show why I have given this sketch the divisions in which it lies. Hilaire Belloc, King's Land, January 1911. The end of section 1. The end of the preface. Section 2. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 2. Chapter 1. The Political Theory of the Revolution. The political theory upon which the Revolution proceeded has, especially in this country, suffered ridicule as local, as ephemeral, and as fallacious. It is universal, it is eternal, and it is true. It may be briefly stated thus, that a political community pretending to sovereignty, that is, pretending to a moral right of defending its existence against all other communities, derives the civil and temporal authority of its laws not from its actual rulers, nor even from its magistracy, but from itself. But the community cannot express authority unless it possesses corporate initiative, that is, unless the mass of its component units are able to combine for the purpose of a common expression, are conscious of a common will, and have something in common which makes the whole sovereign indeed. It may be that this power of corporate initiative and of corresponding corporate expression is forbidden to men. In that case, no such thing as a sovereign community can be said to exist. In that case, patriotism, public opinion, the genius of a people are terms without meaning. But the human race in all times and in all places has agreed that such terms have meaning, and the conception that a community can so live, order, and be itself is a human conception, as consonant to the nature of man as is his sense of right and wrong. It is much more intimately a part of that nature than are the common accidents determining human life, such as nourishment, generation, or repose, nay, more intimate a part of it than anything which attaches to the body. This theory of political morals, though subject to a limitless degradation in practice, underlies the argument of every man who pretends to regard the conduct of the state as a business affecting the conscience of citizens. Upon it relies every protest against tyranny and every denunciation of foreign aggression. He that is most enamored of some set machinery for the government of men, and who regards the sacramental function of an hereditary monarch, as in Russia, the organic character of a native oligarchy, as in England, the mechanical arrangement of election by majorities, or even in a crisis the intense conviction and therefore the intense activity and conclusive power of great crowds as salutary to the state, will invariably, if any one of these engines fail him in the achievement of what he desires for his country, fall back upon the doctrine of an ultimately sovereign community. He will complain that though an election has defeated his ideal, yet true national tradition and true national sentiment were upon his side. If he defends the action of a native oligarchy against the leaders of the populace, he does so by an explanation, more or less explicit, that the oligarchy is more truly national, that it is more truly communal than the engineered expression of opinion of which the demagogue, as he will call them, have been mouthpieces. Even in blaming men for criticizing or restraining an hereditary monarch, the adherent of that monarch will blame them upon the ground that their action is anti-national, that it is anti-communal, and in a word, no man pretending to sanity can challenge, in matters temporal and civil, the ultimate authority of whatever is felt to be, though with what difficulty it is not defined, the general civic sense which builds up in a state. Those words civil and temporal must lead the reader to the next consideration, which is that the last authority of all does not reside even in the community. It must be admitted by all those who have considered their own nature and that of their fellow beings, that the ultimate authority in any act is God. Or if the name of God sound unusual to an English publication today, then what now takes the place of it for many, an imperfect phrase, the moral sense. Thus, if there be cast together in some abandoned place a community of a few families so depraved or so necessitous that, against the teachings of their own consciences, as well as knowing that they are doing is what we call wrong, yet they will unanimously agree to do it, then that agreement of theirs, though certainly no temporal or civil authority can be quoted against it, is yet unjustifiable. Another authority lies behind. Still more evidently would this be true if, of say 12, 7 decided, knowing the thing to be wrong, that the wrong thing should be done. 5 stood out for the right, and yet the majority possessed by the 7 should be determined a sufficient authority for the wrongful command. But it is to be noted that this axiom only applies where the authority of the moral law, God, as the author of this book, with due deference to his readers, would prefer to say, is recognized and yet flouted. If those 12 families do sincerely believe such and such a general action to be right, then not only is their authority, when they carry it into practice, a civil and temporal authority, it is an authority absolute in all respects. And further, if upon a division of opinion among them, not perhaps a bare majority, nay, perhaps not a majority at all, but at any rate a determinate current of opinion, determinate in intensity and in weight, that is, as well as in numbers, declares an action to be right, then that determinate weight of opinion gives to its resolve a political authority, not only civil and temporal, but absolute. Beyond it and above it there is no appeal. In other words, men may justly condemn, and justly have, in 1,000 circumstances condemned, the theory that a mere decision on the major part of the community was necessarily right in morals. It is for that matter self-evident that if one community decides in one fashion, another also sovereign in the opposite fashion, both cannot be right. Reasoning men have also protested, and justly, against the conception that what a majority in numbers, or even what is more compelling still, a unanimity of decision in a community, may order, may not only be wrong, but may be something which that community has no authority to order, since, though it possesses a civil and temporal authority, it acts against that ultimate authority which is its own consciousness of right. Men may and do justly protest against the doctrine that a community is incapable of doing deliberate evil. It is as capable of such an action as is an individual. But men nowhere do or can deny that the community, acting as it thinks right, is ultimately sovereign. There is no alternative to so plain a truth. Let us take it then as indubitable that where civil government is concerned, the community is supreme, if only from the argument that no organ within the community can prove its right to withstand the corporate will, when once that corporate will shall find expression. All arguments which are advanced against this prime axiom of political ethics are, when they are analysed, found to repose upon a confusion of thought. Thus a man will say, this doctrine would lead my country to abandon her suzerainty over that other nation, but were I to consent to this, I should be weakening my country, to which I owe allegiance. The doctrine compels him to no such muddlement. The community of which he is a member is free to make its dispositions for safety and is bound to preserve its own life. It is for the oppressed to protest and to rebel. Similarly, men think that this doctrine in some way jars with the actual lethargy and actual imbecility of men in their corporate action. It does nothing of the kind. This lethargy, that imbecility, and all the other things that limit the application of the doctrine in no way touch its right reason, any more than the fact that the speech of all men is imperfect contradicts the principle that man has a moral right to self-expression. That a dumb man cannot speak at all, but must write, is so far from a contradiction, a proof of the truth that speech is the prime expression of a man. And in the same way a community utterly without the power of expressing its corporate will is no contradiction, but a proof of the general rule that such expression and the imposing of such decisions are normal to mankind. The very oddity of the contrast between the abnormal and the normal aids us in our decision, and when we see a people conquered and not persuaded, yet making no attempt at rebellion, or a people free from foreign oppression, yet bewildered at the prospect of self-government, the oddity of the phenomena proves our rule. But though all this be true, there stands against the statement of our political axiom not a contradiction added, but a criticism, and all men with some knowledge of their fellows and of themselves at once perceive, first, that the psychology of corporate action differs essentially from the psychology of individual action, and secondly that, in proportion to the number, the discussions, the lack of intimacy, and in general the friction of the many, corporate action by a community, corporate self-realization, and the imposition of a corporate will varies from the difficult to the impossible. On this no words need be wasted. All men who reason and who observe are agreed that in proportion to distance, numbers, and complexity, the difficulty of self-expression within a community increases. We may get in a lively people explosions of popular will, violent, acute, and certainly real, but rare. We may attempt, with a people more lethargic, to obtain some reflection of popular will through the medium of a permanent machinery of deputation which, less than any other, perhaps permits a great community to express itself truly. We may rely upon the national sympathies of an aristocracy or of a king. But in any case, we know that the large communities can only indirectly and imperfectly express themselves where the permanent government of the whole interest is concerned. Our attachment, which may be passionate to the rights of the common will, we must satisfy either by demanding a loose federation of small self-governing states, or submitting the central government of a large one to occasional insurrection and to violent corporate expression of opinion which shall readjust the relations between the governor and the governed. All this is true, but such a criticism of the theory in political morals which lay behind the Revolution, the theory that the community is sovereign, is no contradiction. It only tells us that pure right cannot act untrammeled in human affairs, and that it acts in some conditions more laboriously than in others. It gives not a jot of authority to any alternative thesis. Footnote 1. We need not waste any time upon those who talk about such and such a form of government being good because it works. The use of such language connotes that the user of it is fatigued by the effort of thought. For what is working for example, successful action in any sphere, the attainment of certain ends in that sphere. What are those ends in a state? If material well-being, then there is an end to talk of patriotism, the nation, public opinion, and the rest of it, which, as we all very well know, men have always regarded and always will regard as the supreme matters of public interest. If the end is not material well-being, but a sense of political freedom and of the power of the citizen to react upon the state, then to say that an institution works, though apparently not democratic, is simply to say that under such and such conditions that institution achieves the ends of democracy most nearly. In other words, to contrast the good working of an institution superficially undemocratic with democratic theory is meaningless. The institution works in proportion as it satisfies that political sense which perfect democracy would, were it attainable, completely satisfy. The end of Section 2. Section 3. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 3, Chapter 1, concluded. Such is the general theory of the Revolution, to which the command of Jean-Jacques Rousseau over the French tongue gave imperishable expression in that book whose style and logical connection may be compared to some exact and strong piece of engineering. He entitled it The Contrat Social, and it became the formula of the revolutionary creed. But though no man perhaps has put the prime truth of political morals so well, that truth was as old as the world. It appears in the passionate rhetoric of 100 leaders, and has stood at the head or has been woven into the laws of free states without number. In the English language, the Declaration of Independence is perhaps its noblest expression, and though this document was posterior to the great work of Rousseau, and though the genius of Jefferson was in some part descended from it, its language, and still more the actions of those who drafted and supported it, are sufficient to explain what I mean to the English readers. Now, with this general theory there stands connected on the one hand certain great principles without which it would have no meaning, and also, on the other hand, a number of minor points concerning no more than the machinery of politics. The first are vital to democracy. The second, in spite of their great popularity at the time of the Revolution, and of the sanction which the Revolution gave them, nay, of their universality, since the Revolution have in reality nothing to do with the revolutionary theory itself. Of these two categories, the type of the first is the doctrine of the equality of man. The type of the second is the mere machinery called representative. The doctrine of the equality of the man is a transcendent doctrine, a dogma as we call such doctrines in the field of transcendental religion. It corresponds to no physical reality which we can grasp. It is hardly to be adumbrated even by metaphors drawn from physical objects. We may attempt to rationalize it by saying that what is common to all men is not more important, but infinitely more important than the accident by which men differ. We may compare human attributes to tridimensional and personal attributes to bidimensional measurements. We may say that whatever man has of his nature is all the standards of man, and we may show that in all such things men are potentially equal. None of these metaphors explains the matter, still less do any of them satisfy the demand of those to whom the dogma may be incomprehensible. Its truth is to be arrived at for these in a negative manner. If men are not equal, then no scheme of jurisprudence, no act of justice, no movement of human indignation, no exaltation of fellowship has any meaning. The doctrine of the equality of man is one which, like many of the great transcendental doctrines, may be proved by the results consequent upon its absence. It is in man to believe it, and all lively societies believe it. It is certainly not in man to prove the equality of men, save, as I have said, by negation. But it demands no considerable intellectual facility to perceive that void of the doctrine of equality. The conception of political freedom and a community's moral right to self-government disappear. Now, to believe that doctrine positively, and to believe it ardently, to go on crusade for that religious point, was indeed characteristic of the French. It required the peculiar and inherited religious temper of the French, which had for so many hundred years seized and defined point after point in the character of man, to grow enamored of this definition and to feel it not in the intellect but as it were in their bones. They became soldiers for it, and that enormous march of theirs overrunning Europe, which may not inaptly be compared to their adventures in the 12th century when they engaged upon the Crusades, was inspired by no one part of the doctrine of political freedom more strongly than by this doctrine of equality. The scorn which was in those days universally felt for that pride which associates itself with the things not inherent to a man, notably and most absurdly with capricious differences of wealth, never ran higher, and the passionate sense of justice which springs from this profound and fundamental social dogma of equality, as it moved France during the Revolution to frenzy, so also moved it to creation. Those who ask how it was that a group of men sustaining all the weight of civil conflict within and of universal war without, yet made time enough in 20 years to frame the codes which govern modern Europe, to lay down the foundation of universal education, of a strictly impersonal scheme of administration, and even in detail to remodel the material face of society, in a word, to make modern Europe, must be content for their reply to learn that the Republican energy had for its flame and its excitant this vision, a sense almost physical of the equality of man. The minor points which wove themselves into the political practice of democracy during the Revolution, which are not of its principles, and which would not, were they abstracted, affect its essence, are of quite another and less noble kind. I have taken as the chief of these the machinery of deputation or of representation. The representative system had been designed for a particular purpose under the influence of the Church, and especially of the monastic orders who invented it in the Middle Ages. It had been practiced as a useful check upon the national monarchy in France, and as a useful form of national expression in times of crisis, or when national initiative was peculiarly demanded. In Spain it became, as the Middle Ages proceeded, a very vital national and local thing, varying from place to place. It is not surprising that Spain, seeing that in her territory the first experiments in representation were made, should have thus preserved it popular and alive. In England, representation, vigorous as everywhere else in the true Middle Ages, narrowed and decayed at their close, until in the 17th century it had become a mere scheme for aristocratic government. In France, for nearly 200 years before the Revolution, it had fallen into disuse, but an active memory of it still remained, especially a memory of its value in critical moments, when a consultation of the whole people was required, and when the corporate initiative of the whole people must be set at work in order to save the state. It is no wonder, therefore, that the French, on the eve of the Revolution, clamoured for a revival of representation, or, as the system was called in its French tongue, the States General. But as a permanent machine of government, no one in Europe had the least idea how the system might serve the ends of democracy. In England, democracy was not practiced, nor was representation connected with the conception of it. The nation had forgotten democracy as completely as it had forgotten the religion and the old ideals of the Middle Ages. In those parts of Christendom in which this ancient Christian institution of a parliament had not narrowed to be the mask of an oligarchy or dwindled to be a mere provincial custom, its use had disappeared. The ancient function of representation, when it had been most lively and vigorous, that is, in the Middle Ages, was occasionally to initiate a national policy in critical moments, but more generally to grant taxes. What a democratic parliament might do, no one in 1789 could conceive. There was indeed one great example of democratic representation in existence, the example of the United States. But the conditions were wholly different from those of Europe. No true central power yet existed there, no ancient central institution, no crown, nor any custom of the city. The numbers over which American representative democracy then held power were not to be compared to the 25 millions who inhabited the French realm, and even so, most of what counted in their lives was regulated by a system of highly local autonomy, for they were as scattered as they were few, and the wisest and strongest and best were dependent upon slaves. In Europe, I repeat, the experiment was untried, and it is one of the chief faults of the French revolutionaries that, having been compelled in the critical moment of the opening of the Revolution to the use of election and representation, they envisioned the permanent use of a similar machinery as something sacred to and normal in the democratic state. True, they could not foresee modern parliamentarism. Nothing could be more alien to their conception of the state than the deplorable method of government which parliamentarism everywhere tends to introduce today. True, the French people during the Revolutionary Wars made short work of parliamentary theory, and found it a more national thing to follow a soldier, being by that time all soldiers themselves, and to incarnate in a dictator the will of the nation. But though the French revolutionaries could not have foreseen what we call parliamentarism today, and though the society from which they sprang made short work of the oligarchic pretensions of a parliament when the realities of the national struggle had to be considered, yet they did, as a fact, pay an almost absurd reverence to the machinery of representation and election. They went so far as to introduce it into their attempted reform of the Church. They introduced it everywhere into civil government, from the smallest units to the highest. They even for a moment played with the illusion in that most real of games which men can ever play at, the business of arms. They allowed the election of officers. They were led to do this by that common fallacy, more excusable in them than in us, which confounds the individual will with the corporate. A representative, they thought, could in some way be the permanent receptacle of his electorate. They imagined that corporate initiative was always sufficiently active, in no matter what divisions or subdivisions, to react at once upon the delegate, to guide him as may be guided by a driven animal, or to command him as may be commanded as a servant. It was in vain that Rousseau, the great exponent of the democratic theory upon which France attempted to proceed, had warned posterity against the possible results of the representative system. They fell into the error, and it possesses many of their descendants to this day. Rousseau's searching mind perceived indeed no more than the general truth that men who consent to a representative system are free only while the representatives are not sitting. But as is so often the case with institutions of genius, though he saw not the whole of the evil, he had put his finger upon its central spot, and from that main and just principle which he laid down, that under a merely representative system men cannot be really free, flow all those evils which we now know to attach to this method of government. What a rather clumsy epigram has called the audacity of elected persons is part of this truth. The evident spectacle of modern parliamentary nations driven against their will into economic conditions which appall them proceeds again from the same truth. The conspicuous and hearty contempt into which parliamentary institutions have everywhere fallen again proceeds from it, and there proceeds from it that further derivative plague, that the representatives themselves have now everywhere become more servile than the electorate, and that in all parliamentary countries a few intriguers are the unworthy depositories of power, and by their service of finance permit the money dealers to govern us all today. Rousseau, I say, the chief prophet of the Revolution, had warned the French of this danger. It is a capital example of his talent, for the experiment of democratic representation had not yet in his time been tried, but which much more is that power of his by which he not only stamped and issued the gold of democracy as it had never till then been minted. No one man makes a people or their creed, but Rousseau more than any other man made vocal the creed of a people, and it is advisable or necessary for the reader of the Revolution to consider at the outset of his reading of what nature was Rousseau's abundant influence upon the men who remodelled the society of Europe between 1789 and 1794. Why did he dominate those 5 years, and how was it that he dominated them increasingly? An explanation of Rousseau's power merits a particular digression, for few who express themselves in the English tongue have cared to understand it, and in the academies provincial men have been content to deal with this great writer as though he were in some way inferior to themselves. The end of section 3. The end of chapter 1.